Welcome to Counterpoint. I'm Tanya Granick-Allen. So the Beijing Olympics have just wrapped up. And how did they go? Well, many of us have seen footage coming out of the Olympics showing athletes being forcibly quarantined with a positive test, or those who are scared to even discuss things with the media for fear of retribution while on Chinese soil. And of course, in the lead up to the Olympics, there was so much activity and discussion as to whether these games should have even been allowed to be awarded to China for the second time to Beijing in the past 20 years. And should a country with clearly many violations of human rights abuses be allowed to even host the games? Seems like these games have become very politicized, perhaps rightfully so. Well, let's discuss a little bit more in detail as to what went into the preparation of the games and some of the larger political issues at play. And joining me now to do that is Yaqui Wang, Senior China Researcher with Human Rights Watch. Welcome, Yaqui. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
It's such an important discussion. I'm very much a strong proponent of human rights. I'm very anti-communist. So these games were in particular of interest to me. Many around the world in the international community don't realize what the situation on the ground was like in the lead up to the Olympic Games. Yes, with the human rights conditions, but also in the preparation to get physically prepared for the games from the communist Chinese government. Could you share some of the stories that you've heard?
Well, I think first of all, we need to be reminded that crimes against humanity happen in Xinjiang. 1 million people are imprisoned in those camps, and the people who are not in the camps are suffered to mass surveillance, torture. For people in the camps, suffered to torture, forced sterilization, forced abortion, horrible abuses going on in the camp. So for the people who are not in the camp, they're suffering, mass surveillance, and their freedom of movement, their freedom of speech are terribly suppressed. That's in Xinjiang. Then in Hong Kong, there are terrible, dramatic crackdowns on freedoms in the city. Then for the rest of China, there are horrible censorship, there's surveillance. So the situation for human rights is really bad. That's the overall big situation. In terms of the games, the Chinese government has stringently censored the criticism of the game. The Chinese people didn't choose to host the Beijing game. Then people criticize the game. Then they get censored and they get harassed. Activists warned by the government that if you say something bad about the game during the game, you would be detained or possibly imprisoned. So that's the big background.
My goodness. And along that theme of detention, we saw that many athletes who chose to come to the games, because let's be clear, several athletes chose themselves to boycott the games, but those who did participate, I saw video footage on Twitter and on various social media platforms of athletes in tears, decrying the treatment that I guess they weren't expecting when they traveled to communist China.
Well, I think, we have to know that it's the pandemic and there are restrictions. Some restrictions are reasonable. I think people who participate in Tokyo Games complain too. But we need to know that there's censorship going on. So the government, try to suppress athletes talking about the bad conditions. Also, even for those who didn't complain, probably it's because they knew that if I complain about the conditions, there could be consequences, because the Chinese government has threatened that if you say, you threatened that you have to abide by Chinese laws and regulations. That's like a very fake threat saying, if you could criticize the government, you could be possibly punished. So we have to know that people who didn't speak doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have complaints.
Right. And we saw that some athletes said nothing while they were on Chinese soil, but once they returned home, then they started opening their mouths to some of the more egregious actions that they personally witnessed. We only have about 40 seconds left, and we can pick this up after the break as well. But how do you feel the IOC, the International Olympic Committee, has behaved with relation to China in this circumstance?
Well, I think they have done a terrible job. They have not spoken up about the human rights conditions in China at all before the game, during the game, after the game. At the same time, they have, participate in the Chinese government's propaganda, especially regarding the Peng Shuang case, who's the tennis star who got disappeared after she made a sexual assault allegation against a very high-level official.
And actually, I want to talk about her case in a little more detail. We're going to cut for commercial break. Welcome back to Counterpoint. We're discussing the recently wrapped up Beijing Olympics that just happened. There's been a lot of criticism as to whether these games should have gone forward. And joining me again to discuss this is Yaqui Wang, senior China researcher with Human Rights Watch. Yaqui, before the commercial break, we were discussing about the infamous tennis star Peng Shuang, who made allegations of sexual impropriety against a senior government official. And then she sort of went missing. But I found it interesting that the IOC was sort of taking an involvement in that case. They even made comments on it in December in a statement. And to me, it seemed that there seemed to be some participation on behalf of the IOC with the Chinese government. Could you expand on that, please?
Absolutely. There's no way that the IOC can have a conversation, multiple conversations with Peng Shuang without the involvement with the Chinese authorities at all. That just doesn't happen in the Chinese context.
Meaning that the IOC has, like, the government will always insert themselves in when the IOC wants to comment on that case?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, Peng Shuang made the case, and for 30 minutes, her post on social media was widely discussed. Then the Chinese government censorship came in and censored everything about, not just about her case, about anything regarding Peng Shuang, regarding the Zhang Gaoli, which is the official who was being accused. So just by that level of censorship, you can know the government's apparatus was in full operation to suppress the news. Then Peng Shuang disappeared, and then they reappeared in some staged, dinner or activity. So obviously, the event was very much controlled by the government. And for the IOC to just have some dinner or conversation with Peng Shuang, it's obviously, the government played a role in terms of how this was played out.
So, like many Canadians, I sort of observe this pre-Olympic activity from a distance. And I knew there's something that just didn't feel comfortable going on in China. And, I questioned why these Olympics were awarded, again, the second time in about 20 years. One thing I found interesting was that the athlete chosen to light the Olympic cauldron was a Uyghur skier, Dinigir Yiliam. And I found that interesting because we know there have been documented human rights atrocities with the Uyghur population, but here a Uyghur athlete was selected to light the cauldron. Explain some of the politics around that decision.
Well, I think it's the Chinese government basically, it's a middle finger to the rest of the world saying, I don't care about your criticism towards the horrible abuses. I'm using a Uyghur athlete to show that I don't care. I do whatever I want to do. I don't agree with your criticism. So that's the message the government is trying to send by using a Uyghur athlete. And to be honest, we don't know whether she chose to participate or not, and whether she had any freedom. I mean, she obviously doesn't have the freedom to participate. But people are saying, she participated in this whole propaganda thing, maybe to save her family's lives and, save them from going to those camps.
One thing I found interesting is that she never did appear before the journalists, which is normal for an athlete to do after they compete. They kind of go through that media gauntlet. She only appeared to state media. Again, it's just strange. It's strange. Your little spidey sense perks up as to what's going on there. And is there something more untoward? And again, you can share with us what have been some of the Uyghur human rights violations against that Turkic population.
Well, I mean, actually, the IOC requires athletes to pass this area where journalists are present. So, she failed to fulfill a requirement. And then she only talked to the Chinese state media, which is not any other media outlets, which means, the Chinese government tried to suppress how she is presented and what she says. So that's so obvious. And this has to be understood in the context that the Chinese government is committing terrible atrocities in Xinjiang. As I said, 1 million people are in the camps and they are being subjected to forced abortion, sterilization, torture and all that thing. And for the people who are not in the camps, their speech are terribly, suppressed, and there's horrible surveillance going on.
Okay, we only have 20 seconds left, but after the Beijing Games 2022, do you think China has come out looking better or worse?
Well, I don't think it comes out looking better at all. I actually think this Olympic Games gave an opportunity for people to talk about the human rights violation going on in the country. For a lot of people who care about sports, they didn't know what's going on in China. And now because of Olympics, they were looking at this.
Okay, well, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. Welcome back. Joining me now to share his expertise is Dr. Charles Burton, Senior Fellow at the MacDonald Laurier Institute, Center for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad, and a former counselor at the Canadian Embassy in Beijing. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Burton. I appreciate your time. This has really been an issue front of mind for many Canadians over the past 2 years when we think about the two Michaels and how Canadian-Chinese relations go forward. In the midst of this, we have now inserted and now just wrapped up the Beijing Olympics 2022. Should these Olympics, on a more macro level, should these Olympics have been able to proceed?
Well, thank you, Tanya. I think it would have been much better if we'd moved the Olympics to other venues outside of the People's Republic of China, because, these Olympics are hosted by autocratic dictatorships like China's to try and affirm the legitimacy of their regime, particularly domestically to people inside China. So, we really don't want to be enabling a regime which poses a serious geopolitical threat to the world and which is guilty of gross violations of the norms of human rights in treatment of its people, particularly the ongoing genocide against the Uyghur Muslim minority in the northwestern region. So, from that point of view, it's really very unfortunate that these Olympics went through. And of course, none of the athletes were able to express any political concerns while in China for fear of going to the same place that Kovrig and Svavor might have gone on spurious charges. So it was something of a win for China, but it's certainly something that Canada should have avoided.
Well, speaking on Canada, and when we speak about Kovrig and Spavor, the two Michaels, given how dramatic, for lack of a better term, dramatic the past 2 years have been in dealing with the two Michaels and locating them and I guess negotiating their release and repatriating them, I understand Canada had a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics. Should Canada have just simply boycotted these Olympics altogether?
I mean, that's the $60 million question. The diplomatic boycott's not that significant. I mean, we only sent one person to the recent Tokyo Olympics, so it's not actually something that's very substantive. I think that it might have sent a message inside China to the Chinese people that there were a lot of significant Western countries who had no representation in China. So the leaders that Xi Jinping, the president, was able to meet while they were in Beijing for the Olympics, and who appeared on the Chinese TV praising the Xi regime, were mostly autocratic states, dictatorships, and states around China in Western Europe, plus, of course, Vladimir Putin. So from that point of view, obviously it would have been like an enormous mistake to send any of our senior Canadian officials to Beijing. But as I say, that the question really is that the athletes were being used as political pawns, and we really shouldn't do that. But on the other hand, they prepared 4 years to show their outstanding skills in their sport of choice, and they should have an opportunity to demonstrate those and to compete. It just shouldn't have been on the soil of China. There were proposals made to split up the Olympics between, say, Vancouver and Seattle and maybe some other places to allow the athletes an opportunity to compete, but not put them in the position where they'd have to be making nice to the standing committee of the Chinese Politburo and the Chinese Communist Party leader, Xi Jinping.
And I think that's a very fair point. So many of us saw, and I mentioned this with my earlier guest, so many of us saw footage coming out of, personal Twitter accounts, athletes crying, they might have tested positive for COVID. They don't know where they're being taken. They feel there's like a chilling effect, obviously, on free speech. You cannot dissent in China. You better wait till you're back on your soil, if you're going to, on your home soil, if you're going to speak out negatively of your experience. I feel, and we only have half a minute left before commercial, but I really do feel that the athletes really got the short end of the stick here.
Yes, definitely. I mean, these are people not typically very politically aware, but certainly I don't think they want to get into a situation where they could be tacitly endorsing genocide and Chinese regime's other activities. And, what's been going on now with Ukraine affirms that this regime is a dangerous one and a threat to world peace. And our athletes really should be kept well away from that sort of dynamic.
Right. Very well said. Well, we're going to continue this discussion right when we return from this commercial break. Please stick around. Welcome back. We're joined by Dr. Charles Burton, who's unpacking a lot of the drama surrounding the recently wrapped Beijing Olympics. Thank you again, Dr. Charles, for joining me. When I looked at some of the footage, or at least the news reports coming out of China, I found it quite interesting that the athlete selected to light the Olympic cauldron, that's the cauldron that has the eternal flame of the Olympics, was a Uyghur athlete. And I thought, wow, after all these reports of allegations of human rights abuses, perhaps documented human rights abuses, why would China choose a Uyghur athlete? I mean, I think I know the answer, but I'd like to hear it from you.
Well, certainly the regime wants to suggest that there's nothing going on in the Uyghur regions and that these concentration camps are re-education facilities that the Uyghurs freely enter, whereas we know that they're covered with barbed wire, guard towers, and that the conditions inside the camps are dangerous for women. There are extensive reports, credible ones, of sexual abuse of women in the camps by Chinese men, and that they are not allowed to speak their language or practice their religion while in the camps. And parents are kept separated from their children, who are sent to orphanages where they are educated in the Chinese language and not allowed to have any contact to their indigenous culture. So, the idea that a Uyghur athlete is leading the march to light the cauldron would be particularly repugnant to the Uyghur Canadians here in Canada, who don't have contact with their families, don't know what's going on, and are having trouble sleeping at night, feeling powerless over trying to stop the genocidal policies that China is carrying out against their family members, friends, and countrymen. So, it was a really disturbing thing to see, and I'm pretty sure that Uyghur athlete was coerced into pretending that everything is just fine here, and he's proud to represent the People's Republic of China. I can't imagine that he could have been feeling any kind of clear conscience as he marched to the cauldron to light it.
Yes, and perhaps one shred of evidence towards your point there was that the athlete was never permitted, even after he competed in this field, he was never permitted to actually speak to the international media. It was simply, he was only permitted to speak through the Chinese state media. So that perhaps could give us an indication of, what kind of duress or controlled situation was going on there. I also, as a Canadian, we have so many expat Chinese, we have so many from Hong Kong. Seeing what has happened in Hong Kong in the past, 20 months or so, the suspension, the elimination of civil liberties for those in Hong Kong, and the assertion of the national law by the Chinese,
Do we owe it to our fellow Canadians who are of Hong Kong descent or who've come and escaped to do something? I mean, it's not like China has had this. They've been sitting quiet. Yes, there's continued human rights violations with the Uyghurs, but what happened in Hong Kong is very recent. People are continually being jailed. In addition to the two Michaels, do we not owe them something to stand up?
Yes, I think that, it gets to the point where we really have to be looking at how we engage with China. And do we allow China to continue to engage in disinformation over Canadian media about what's going on in Hong Kong? And do we allow the Chinese ambassador to be going to universities up and down Canada, universities that typically have China-related funding, making speeches defending the Chinese position when our ambassador in Beijing would never be allowed to do the same? So I think from that point of view, Canada really should be doing more to make it clear to the Chinese regime that it's not business as usual. And if they want to sanction us economically or try and impose non-tariff barriers on our Canadian commodity exports to China, that's just a price that we will have to pay for standing up for what's right and for our liberal democratic values against the Chinese threat.
I agree. Well, listen, Dr. Burton, thank you so much for your insights today. It's always a pleasure speaking with you, and we'll have you on again in the future.
Thank you very much.
That was Dr. Charles Burton from the MacDonald Laurier Institute, and his final thought that Canada really ought to rethink how we engage with China, even if it does come at a cost, I think is a very important central one. For Counterpoint, I'm Tanya Granick-Allen.